Sarah Whitmore pressed her hand over her son's mouth to keep him from crying. Not because she was angry, because if anyone inside that diner heard him, they would come outside. And she could not bear to be looked at the way people had been looking at her lately, like she was something that had crawled out of the dirt and refused to die. Ethan was 6 years old and he was hungry, and there was nothing on that plate but cold scraps someone else had left behind. And her daughter Lily, 8 years old, was quietly pushing her own portion toward her brother without saying a single word. If you're watching this story for the first time, please take a moment right now to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to that alley behind the diner in Harlan Creek, Montana in the summer of 1887, because what happened next is something nobody in that town would ever forget. She had not eaten since Tuesday. It was Friday now, and Sarah Whitmore sat on an overturned crate behind Harlan Creek's only diner, watching her children share a plate of food that a stranger had left half-finished on a table inside. One of the kitchen boys, a teenager named Pete, who had a kind face and not much else to offer, had slipped it out the back door to her without saying a word. He had just set it down, looked at Ethan, and Lily looked at Sarah, and then gone back inside. He hadn't been able to look at her eyes. Most people couldn't lately. "Mama," Lily said quietly, "there's still some bread left. Do you want it?" "I already ate, sweetheart." She hadn't. But the words came out smooth and practiced the way they always did now, because Sarah had been lying to her children about meals for the better part of 3 months, and she had gotten very good at it. Ethan was gnawing on a piece of cold fried chicken with the focused, wordless dedication of a boy who had learned not to ask questions about where food came from. He was 6 years old. He should have been asking questions about everything. The fact that he had stopped was something Sarah thought about every night when she couldn't sleep, which was every night. "You reckon Pete will bring more tomorrow?" Ethan asked. He wasn't looking at either of them. He was looking at the bone in his hand. "Maybe," Sarah said, "if we're polite and quiet." "We're always polite and quiet." "I know, baby." Lily reached over and wiped something from her brother's chin with her sleeve. It was such a motherly gesture on the face of an 8-year-old that Sarah had to look away for a moment. She pressed her back against the rough wooden wall of the diner and stared up at the sky, which was blazing and merciless the way Montana skies in August always were, like even the heavens had decided to turn up the heat on whatever suffering was already in progress down below. Daniel Whitmore had been dead for 4 months. 4 months since the accident at the Callaway mill. 4 months since the sheriff had come to her door with his hat in his hands. 4 months since she had sat down at her kitchen table and stared at the wall for what felt like an entire day, while Ethan and Lily slept in the next room, not knowing yet that the loudest, steadiest presence in their world had just gone silent forever. Daniel had been a mechanic. A good one. Everyone in Harlan Creek had respected him, brought their wagons and their equipment and their problems to him, shaken his hand, called him by his first name. When he died, they had come to the funeral in their best clothes and pressed her hand and told her they were sorry, and she had believed every single one of them. She had been wrong about that. The bank had given her 60 days. She had used every one of them trying to find a solution that didn't exist. The medical bills from Daniel's last 3 days, the desperate, futile 3 days the doctor had spent trying to save him, had consumed everything they'd saved. The house went next. She had stood on the porch with both children beside her and watched 2 men she didn't know carry their furniture out to the road like it was trash, because legally it was the bank's trash now, and there was nothing she could say about it. She had applied for work at every establishment in Harlan Creek that would have her. The laundry, the milliner's shop, the hotel. She had picked up whatever she could, mending clothes, washing linens for the boarding house on 3rd Street, helping with dishes at this very diner 3 evenings a week. At the height of it, she had been working 3 separate jobs simultaneously, waking before dawn and falling into bed so late the children were already asleep, dragging herself through days that felt like something between survival and slow drowning. And still it hadn't been enough. She had started skipping her own meals somewhere in the 2nd month. just skipping them quietly, telling herself she wasn't hungry, telling herself she was fine. She wasn't fine. She'd lost weight she didn't have room to lose, and her ankles swelled at the end of long days, and sometimes her hands shook when she tried to thread a needle. But Ethan and Lily needed to eat, and on the money she was making, there was simply not enough for everyone. The diner work had ended 2 weeks ago. Mrs. Garfield, who owned the establishment, had let her go with what she apparently felt was generous frankness. "People are talking, Sarah," she'd said, standing in her kitchen with her arms crossed, not quite meeting Sarah's eyes. "About you being here. Some of the customers don't like it. I can't afford to lose business over—" She had gestured vaguely, as if pointing at Sarah's entire existence, "over a situation like yours." "A situation like mine," Sarah had repeated. "You know what I mean." She did know. She had heard the words clearly enough from other mouths in the market and on the street, and through the walls of the boarding house room she shared with her children for $4 a week. Words like burden and charity case, and ought to know better. A woman built like her, they said, ought to be able to find herself some kind of work, as if her body was the problem, as if the problem was anything she could fix by tomorrow. They said she was lazy. They said she was taking advantage of whatever sympathy she could scrape together. They said a real mother would have figured something out by now. None of them knew about the 3 jobs. None of them knew about the meals she hadn't eaten. None of them knew about the nights she had sewn by lamplight until her fingers bled trying to finish one more order, earn one more dollar, buy a little more time. Because she hadn't told anyone, because asking for help felt like confirming everything they were already saying about her, that she couldn't manage, that she was weak, that her children would be better off with someone else raising them. That last thought was the one that kept her awake longest. She was losing. She could feel it the way you feel the ground shifting under your feet before a flood. Not the flood itself, yet, just the terrible warning of it. The money she had left would cover the boarding house room for maybe 3 more weeks. After that, she didn't know. She told herself she would figure something out. She had been telling herself that for 4 months. Behind the diner, Lily was now holding Ethan's hand and telling him something in a low, serious voice. Sarah couldn't hear the words. She didn't try to. Whatever Lily was telling him, it was probably something that an 8-year-old shouldn't have to know how to say, and Sarah was so tired of thinking about all the things her children were learning too young. She heard boots on the gravel before she saw the man. He came around the corner of the diner, the way men in this town always moved, like they owned whatever ground they were standing on, and stopped when he saw them. He was tall, big in the shoulders, in the way that came from decades of real work, not from showing off. His hat was pulled low against the August sun, and his expression was unreadable, the way people's expressions got when they were looking at something that was making them feel something they didn't know how to name. Sarah recognized him after a moment. Jack Dawson. Everyone in 3 counties knew Jack Dawson by reputation, if not by face. He owned more land north of the Flathead River than any other man in the territory. He was known to be fair with his hired hands and unfair with anyone who tried to cheat him. He had never, as far as Sarah had heard, been particularly known for sentiment. He was staring at her children. Ethan and Lily had both gone still the way small animals went still when something large and uncertain entered their vicinity. Lily still had her brother's hand. Neither of them said anything. The silence stretched out long enough that Sarah felt the back of her neck prickle. She didn't know what she expected him to say. "Go on, probably. Move along. This is private property." Something dismissive and final, the kind of words that had been aimed at her so frequently in recent months that she had stopped flinching at them. She squared her shoulders. Whatever he said, she would stand up straight and look him in the eye and not let her children see her bend. "How long?" he said. His voice was low and rough-edged, not unkind. "I beg your pardon. How long have they been eating like this?" She felt the heat rise in her face. "That is none of your concern, Mr. Dawson." "Reckon it ain't," he said. He didn't move. "How long?" She wanted to tell him to leave. The words were right there waiting. She was accustomed to refusing help, accustomed to keeping her spine rigid and her chin up, and her grief packed away tight where nobody could get their hands on it. She had been doing that for 4 months, and she was so exhausted by it that sometimes she thought exhaustion itself might be what finally finished her. "A while," she said. "We manage." He looked at the plate. Cold chicken bones and a heel of bread. He looked at Ethan, who was watching him with the wary seriousness of a boy who had learned that adults often brought bad news. He looked at Lily, who was still holding her brother's hand, and watching the rancher with an expression that was trying very hard to be brave and not quite succeeding. Something moved across Jack Dawson's face that Sarah couldn't fully read. His jaw tightened. He pulled his hat off and held it in one hand, which she recognized distantly as a gesture of respect, an old-fashioned thing men did when they wanted to signal that they were not a threat. "Ma'am," he said, "what's your name?" "Sarah Whitmore." "Daniel Whitmore's wife." "His widow," she said. The word still cut when she said it. She said it anyway. He nodded slowly, like he was settling something in himself. "I heard what happened to Daniel. He was a good man. Fixed my wagon once when I was in a bad spot. Wouldn't take what I offered to pay him." She hadn't known that. Daniel had never mentioned it. That was the kind of man he'd been. "Mrs. Whitmore," Jack said, "I'd like to offer you a position. At my ranch. You and your children would have room and board included." Sarah stared at him. "I'm being sincere," he said. "I'm not making sport of you. I need someone who can manage the household cooking, organizing, keeping things in order. My housekeeper left last spring, and I haven't replaced her. It's honest work, and I'll pay you a fair wage." "Mr. Dawson." "Ma'am, I watched 3 men standing by the livery an hour ago taking bets on how much longer you'd last before you had to leave town." His voice didn't change. It stayed level and quiet. But his eyes did something. "I want you to understand that I am not one of those men." Sarah said nothing. "Pack your things," he said. "You're coming home." The words hit her somewhere under her ribs. Not because they were dramatic, because they were simple. Because they sounded for one terrible, unguarded moment like something she had been waiting a long time to hear. She caught herself. She had been fooled before by kindness that had strings attached. She had learned these past 4 months that most offers came wrapped in conditions that only revealed themselves later, and by then you were already trapped. "I appreciate the offer," she said carefully. "But I don't know you, Mr. Dawson. And my children are not. We are not. I won't put them in a situation I can't see clearly." "That's fair," he said. He reached into his coat and pulled out a card, held it out to her. "That's the ranch name and the name of my foreman, Cal Briggs. You can ask anyone in town about Cal. He's been with me 15 years. Ask anyone about him, and they'll tell you who I am by extension." She took the card. Her hand was steadier than she felt. "I'm not asking you to trust me," Jack said. "I'm asking you to consider that your children ate scraps for dinner tonight, and they don't have to." He put his hat back on. "I'll be at the livery until noon tomorrow. If you don't come, I'll understand." He paused. "I'll also know that pride is the only thing standing between those 2 children and a full meal, and I expect you'll think about that tonight." He walked away. Sarah watched him go, his boots quiet on the gravel, his back straight, and she stood there with the card in her hand and her children watching her, and the cold bones of a stranger's leftovers on the plate between them. "Mama," Lily said softly. "Who was that?" "A rancher," Sarah said. "Is he nice?" She looked at the card. She looked at her daughter's serious, careful face. She looked at her son, who had fallen asleep sitting up, his head tipped against the diner wall, one hand still loosely curled around a chicken bone. "I don't know yet," she said. But that night in the narrow room at the boarding house with both children, tucked against her sides, and the sound of the street coming through the thin walls, Sarah lay awake for a long time. She thought about Ethan's hands. She thought about the way Lily had quietly given her brother half her food without being asked. She thought about 3 men at the livery taking bets on her failure, like it was entertainment. She thought about 5 words, spoken in a voice that hadn't wavered. "Pack your things. You're coming home." At 10:30 in the morning, she knocked on Ethan's shoulder and told him to start folding his clothes. He blinked at her, still half asleep, confused. "Where are we going?" he asked. "Somewhere better," she said. She didn't know yet if that was true. She was making a choice in the dark with her children's future in both hands, and the ground beneath her felt as uncertain as it had ever been. But Ethan was hungry. Lily was hungry, and Sarah Whitmore had spent 4 months telling herself she could hold the line alone, and the line had run out. She pressed the card in her pocket. She squared her shoulders the way she always did, and in the early morning quiet, with her son pulling on his boots and her daughter braiding her own hair, with the steady calm of a child who had learned not to ask too many questions, Sarah made a decision that terrified her and felt against all reason, like the first breath she had taken in months. Jack Dawson was not a man who second-guessed himself. He had built everything he owned from 40 acres of frozen ground and 15 years of decisions he had made quickly and stood behind completely. He didn't pace. He didn't revisit. He moved forward the way the river moved, without apology, without looking back at the banks it had already passed. But he stood at the livery for 2 hours past noon, pretending to talk to his horse. Cal Briggs, who had worked for Jack since before the ranch had a proper name, stood a few feet away and said nothing. That was one of the things Jack valued most about Cal. The man understood the difference between a silence that needed filling and one that needed to be left alone. He leaned against the fence post and rolled a cigarette and watched the road with the patient expression of a man who had seen his employer do inexplicable things before and had learned not to ask about them until the inexplicable thing had either worked out or failed spectacularly. "She's not coming," Jack said. "Could be," Cal said. "I shouldn't have pushed her. Woman's got her pride. Pushed her straight into refusing." "Could be," Cal said again. Jack turned around and looked at the road for the 10th time in the past hour. Empty. Dry. Heat shimmering off the dust in waves. He turned back to the horse and rubbed the animal's nose with a roughness that was actually affection, the way he expressed most things. "Her boy fell asleep holding a chicken bone," he said quietly. 6 years old. Cal didn't answer that. There wasn't anything to answer. The wagon appeared at the far end of the road 11 minutes later. Jack heard it before he saw it. The slow creak of wheels, a horse that was working harder than it should have been in the heat. He didn't turn around immediately. He made himself wait, made himself breathe, because he was a man who had learned that showing too much of what you felt was how you ended up on the wrong side of a negotiation. But when he did turn, Sarah Whitmore was sitting on the seat of a borrowed wagon, with her back straight as a fence rail, and her 2 children pressed against her sides like they had decided collectively that they were one unit now and nobody was going to pry them apart. She looked exhausted. She looked proud. She looked like a woman who had made a decision that cost her something and was determined not to let it show how much. He walked to the wagon without hurrying. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Dawson." She held his gaze. "I want to be clear about something before we go any further. I am coming to work. My children are not a burden to be managed, and I am not a charity case to be housed out of pity. If at any point those terms change, I will leave. Those terms won't change. I need your word." He looked at her, straight across, no hedging. "You have it." Something in her shoulders released just slightly, just enough to tell him how tightly she had been holding herself together for this entire conversation. She nodded once sharp and decided. "Then let's go," she said. Ethan looked up at Jack from under the brim of a hat 2 sizes too large for his head. "You got horses?" he asked. "Got about 60 of them," Jack said. The boy's eyes went enormous. Lily, who had been watching the whole exchange with the focused attention of a child who understood that something important had just happened, pressed her lips together like she was trying not to smile, and wasn't entirely succeeding. The ride to the ranch took the better part of an hour, and Jack led the way on horseback while Cal drove the wagon. Sarah didn't speak much. She watched the land the way people watched things they were trying to memorize, storing details against some future need, and Jack had the feeling she was cataloging escape routes out of pure habit. He didn't push conversation. He rode ahead and gave her the silence she needed and trusted that the ranch would say more than he could. When they came over the last rise and the property spread out below them, the main house, the bunkhouse, the stable and the storage barn, and the long fence lines running toward the mountains, he heard Ethan make a sound that wasn't quite a word, just a small, stunned exhalation, the kind that children made when something exceeded their vocabulary. "It's big," Lily said. "It's a lot of work," Jack said. "That's what big means." He heard Sarah exhale once very quietly behind him. He didn't look back. He kept riding. The housekeeper's quarters were attached to the main house by a covered walkway, 2 rooms, a sitting area, their own entrance. He had Cal's wife Agnes come in to show Sarah around while he stayed outside with the children, which he had thought about on the ride over, and decided was the right call. Give Sarah some space without an audience. Agnes was a plain-spoken woman who didn't make things awkward by being performatively kind, which was what Sarah didn't need. She needed to see the rooms without someone watching her face. Ethan immediately attempted to climb the fence. "Don't," Jack said. "Why?" "Because there's a bull on the other side, and he doesn't like strangers." Ethan dropped off the fence with impressive speed. Lily, who had been watching this exchange, made a sound that was definitely a suppressed laugh. "What's the bull's name?" Ethan asked at a safer distance. "Chester." "Chester's a funny name for a bull." "Chester doesn't think so. Don't tell him." Ethan stared at him with enormous seriousness for a moment, then nodded, apparently deciding this was a reasonable precaution. It was such a small thing, such an ordinary, foolish little exchange. But Jack felt something loosen in his chest that had been pulled tight for a very long time, and he looked away from the boy toward the mountains because he didn't want Ethan to see whatever was happening on his face. He had thought about his sister Rebecca every day for 20 years. He had thought about her the morning he'd ridden into Harlan Creek for supplies and seen a woman pressing her hand over a small boy's mouth behind a diner, trying to keep the sound of his hunger contained. Rebecca had been 31 when she died. A widow with 1 daughter, no money, and a town full of people who had watched her struggle and decided that her struggle was her own fault. Jack had been far away. He had gotten the letter 3 weeks after the funeral, and he had read it sitting on the ground outside his tent, and he had not moved for a very long time. He had spent 20 years telling himself there was nothing he could have done. Standing here in his own yard with a 6-year-old boy watching him with Daniel Whitmore's eyes, because he could see it now. The shape of the face, the jaw, Jack understood, with a sudden quiet clarity, that the question of what he could have done for Rebecca was one he was going to spend the rest of his life unable to answer. But this question right here he had already answered, and that was going to have to be enough. Agnes came out of the walkway and gave him a small nod that meant everything was fine. He sent her a nod back that meant thank you, and she went about her business with the discretion she had always shown and that he had always valued. Sarah came out a few minutes later. Her face was composed, carefully arranged, the same armor she had walked through town in. But her eyes were slightly red at the corners, and she blinked once quickly when the light hit them, and Jack looked at his fence line and let her have the moment without comment. "The rooms are more than adequate," she said. "Thank you. Kitchen's yours in the mornings," he said. "I eat early. Cal and the hands eat in the bunkhouse, so it'll just be the 4 of us at the main table, unless you'd prefer separate arrangements." She looked at him. Something shifted in her expression, not suspicion, exactly more like recalibration, like she was adjusting the model she had built of him. "No," she said. "The table is fine." Good. Dinner that first evening was a quiet thing. Sarah cooked from what was in the pantry. She hadn't asked permission, just walked into the kitchen and started working, which Jack appreciated more than he could have said. Agnes had stocked it well. By the time the food was on the table, the whole house smelled like something a house should smell like, and Jack sat at the head of the table and tried not to let his reaction to that become visible on his face. Ethan ate 3 servings. He was careful about it. He wasn't frantic or grabbing. He ate the first serving with focused restraint, and when Jack nodded at him and said, "There's more," he looked at his mother for permission, and she gave it, and he ate the second with a little more ease, and the third with something that was starting to look like it might become happiness at some point. Lily ate 2 servings and kept glancing at Sarah sideways, checking. That was a child who had gotten used to reading her mother's face for information about how much was safe to want. Sarah ate a full plate. Jack watched her eat and said nothing, because what he was thinking was the kind of thing a man did not say at a first dinner to a woman he had known for approximately 7 hours. What he thought was, "When did you last eat?" What he said was, "Pass the salt if you don't mind, Miss Lily." Lily passed it with great ceremony. Jack thanked her with equal ceremony. Ethan watched this transaction with the intense interest of a boy who was already trying to figure out the social rules of a new place. "Do we have to be quiet at dinner?" Ethan asked. Sarah said, "Ethan." "It's all right," Jack said. "No, you don't have to be quiet." At the boarding house, Mrs. Hatch said we had to be quiet or she'd charge extra for the noise. The words landed in the room with a weight that nobody at the table acknowledged out loud. Lily looked at her plate. Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "This isn't a boarding house," Jack said, "and there's no extra charge for noise." "Good," Ethan said with enormous satisfaction and went back to his food. The problem came as Jack had known it would within the first week. Harlan Creek was not a large town. News traveled the way water traveled, finding every crack, filling every low place. By the third morning, people knew that Jack Dawson had brought Sarah Whitmore and her children to his property. By the fifth morning, they had decided they knew why, and their reasons had nothing to do with housekeeping. He heard about it from Cal, who heard it from his wife Agnes, who had heard it at the dry goods store from a woman named Mrs. Hooper, who was the kind of person who considered herself a pillar of the community and functioned primarily as a weather vane for whatever the worst opinion in the room happened to be. "They're saying she maneuvered you," Cal said with the flat economy of a man delivering information he found distasteful. "That she put herself and those children in your path on purpose. Played on your sympathies." Jack said something short and unprintable. "There's more," Cal said. "Of course there is. Harold Pierce is involved." That landed differently. Harold Pierce was the kind of man who wore his influence like other men wore their best coat constantly, deliberately making sure everyone could see it. He controlled 2 of the county commissioners and had a financial interest in a third of the businesses in Harlan Creek, which meant that when Harold Pierce decided something was his business, it had a way of becoming official very quickly. "What does Pierce want with her?" Jack asked. "Don't think it's about her specifically," Cal said. "Think it's about you. You humiliated some of his friends when you called them out in the street. Men like Pierce don't let that sit." Jack had almost forgotten about that. 3 days before he'd gone to the ranch, he'd been in town and had watched a group of men laughing near the livery. He'd caught enough of what they were saying to understand that they were laughing at Sarah, at her appearance, at her situation, at the entertainment value of watching someone try and fail. Something in him had gone very cold and very still, the way it always went, before he did something that he would not apologize for later. He had walked over and stood in front of them and said with complete and deliberate quiet that they were embarrassing their families and they ought to go home. He had said it in the same tone he would have used to point out that a fence needed mending, matter-of-fact, impersonal final. The men had gone. 2 of them were friends of Harold Pierce. He should have anticipated this. "I'll deal with Pierce," Jack said. "He's already filed a formal inquiry," Cal said. "With the county, about the children's welfare." Jack went completely still. "Filed it 2 days ago," Cal continued. "Said there were concerns about the fitness of the home arrangement. Concerns about—" Cal stopped, chose his next words carefully. "About Mrs. Whitmore's character, in relation to you." The thing that happened inside Jack's chest in that moment was not something he could have named cleanly. It was cold, and it was sharp, and it was the particular fury of a man watching a corrupt mechanism aim itself at someone who had done nothing to deserve it. "Does Sarah know?" he asked. Not yet. He found her in the kitchen doing what she did every morning, which was work. She was already ahead of where he needed her to be. Always had been. The woman had a way of seeing what needed doing, and doing it before he'd thought to ask. She turned when she heard him come in, and she must have seen something in his face, because she immediately put down what she was holding and turned to face him fully. "What happened?" she said. He told her straight. No softening, no working up to it, because she was not a woman who needed to be handled, and he'd understood that from the moment she had set her terms in front of the livery. He told her about the inquiry, told her Pierce's name, told her what it meant in practical terms. She was quiet for a long moment after he finished. "They want to take my children," she said. It wasn't a question. "That's what they're threatening," Jack said. "It won't get that far." "How do you know?" "Because I won't let it." She looked at him, not with gratitude, and not with the helpless relief of someone who needed rescuing, but with the measuring, careful assessment of a woman deciding how much of someone's word she could afford to trust. He had seen that look on her face before. He would see it again. He found that he didn't mind it. He preferred people who thought carefully about what they believed to people who believed whatever was easiest. "Mr. Dawson," she said, "I have been in this situation before, in a smaller way, but the same shape. Someone with more power than me deciding my situation was theirs to arrange. And I will tell you what I told them, which is that I will not simply wait while someone else controls what happens to my family." "I'm not asking you to wait," Jack said. "What are you asking?" "I'm asking you to trust that you don't have to fight this one alone." The silence between them was not an empty one. It had the specific weight of two people who both had reasons to be careful with trust, and who were both against their own better judgment, starting to consider whether this might be an exception. "All right," she said finally. "All right," he agreed. What neither of them knew, what neither of them could have anticipated, was that Harold Pierce was not planning to stop with an inquiry. He was planning to escalate. And the thing he was building behind the clean language of county paperwork and civic concern was a case designed to end with Sarah Whitmore having nothing left at all. The letter arrived on a Thursday. Sarah was the one who found it on the front porch, and she was the one who read it, and when Jack came in from the stable, he found her sitting at the kitchen table with the paper in her hands, and both children at school, and the house very, very quiet. He sat down across from her without being invited. She handed him the letter. He read it. Hearing scheduled. 12 days. He set the paper down on the table, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, and the silence had a different quality, now harder, more urgent, the silence of two people who understood that something was coming and that they had less time than they'd thought to be ready for it. "Tell me something," Jack said. She looked at him. "Is there anything about your life in that town, any of it that you're ashamed of?" She held his gaze for a long, still moment. "No," she said. "Good," he said. "Then we have something to work with." 12 days felt like nothing. Sarah had thought when she first read the letter that 12 days was enough time to prepare. She had thought that because she needed to believe it, not because she had any evidence it was true. By the 4th day, she understood she had been wrong. 12 days was barely enough time to understand the shape of what was coming at them, let alone build anything capable of stopping it. Jack had contacts. That was the word he used. Contacts in the flat, factual way he described most things, as if having a network of people who owed him information and occasional favors, was simply a feature of running a large operation. Nothing remarkable about it. Through those contacts, he learned what Harold Pierce was actually filing, which was not merely a welfare inquiry, but a formal petition, supported by signed statements from 11 residents of Harlan Creek. The statements described Sarah as unstable, as negligent as a woman of questionable moral character, who had inserted herself into a wealthy man's household under circumstances that decent people found troubling. Jack read the list of signatories out loud to Cal in the stable quietly, because Sarah was in the main house, and he didn't want her to hear the names before he'd had time to think about how to tell her. Cal listened without expression until Jack got to the 3rd name on the list, and then made a sound like something had bitten him. "Tom Aldridge signed it," Cal said. "He did." "Tom Aldridge, whose wagon Daniel Whitmore fixed for free when he couldn't pay." "The same." Cal was quiet for a moment. "That's a particular kind of ugly," he said finally. "Yes," Jack said. "It is." He told Sarah that evening. She was washing dishes when he came in her back to him, and he watched her go very still as he read the names. She didn't turn around for a moment after he finished. When she did, her face was composed, but there was something in her eyes that was working very hard to stay contained. Not grief exactly, and not quite rage. Something that was both and neither. The look of a person recalibrating the world they thought they'd lived in. "Tom Aldridge," she said. "Yes." She turned back to the dishes. "Daniel fixed that man's wagon in February of last year. It was 14 degrees. He spent 4 hours on it." She scrubbed the same dish twice without appearing to notice. "Tom brought us a pie afterward. I thanked him for it." Jack said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. "Who else?" He read the rest. She listened with her back straight, and her hands in the water, and her jaw set like iron. When he finished, she dried her hands slowly on her apron and turned to face him. "What do we do?" she said. "We get our own witnesses," Jack said. "People who know you, know the truth of how you've lived. The people who know the truth are mostly the same people who watched me struggle and said nothing." Her voice was steady, flat. The voice of someone who had already processed the irony and moved past it because anger was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. "Why would they stand up now?" "Because now there's something official," Jack said. "People who won't lift a hand out of conscience will sometimes act when there's a record being made, when their name could appear on the wrong side of something that history might look at." She considered that. "You know people," she said. It wasn't an accusation, more like an observation she was filing away. "The right kind." "I know enough," he said. "And you'd do that. Spend that. For us." He looked at her directly. "I already am," he said. "That's not a question I need you to ask again." Something moved across her face that she shut down quickly, the way she shut most things down efficiently without drama. But he'd seen it. He was starting to get good at catching the things Sarah Whitmore didn't intend to show. The next morning she did something he hadn't expected. She left the ranch. Cal told him when he came in from the north fence line, and Jack's first reaction was a cold drop in his stomach that he refused to examine too closely. But Cal held up a hand before Jack could say anything. "She took the wagon," Cal said. "Alone. Left the children with Agnes. Said she'd be back before supper." "She say where she was going?" "No, but she had that look." "What look?" Cal thought about it. "The one where she's already decided and she's not asking permission." Jack rode out to check the east pasture and tried not to think about it. He failed. She came back at 4 o'clock with the wagon and a set expression, and didn't volunteer information until he found her in the kitchen, starting supper, at which point he positioned himself in the doorway in a way that wasn't blocking it, but made it clear he was waiting. She glanced at him sideways. "I went to see Dr. Hennessy," she said. "And then to the schoolhouse." Dr. Hennessy was the county physician who had seen Ethan twice since they'd arrived at the ranch, once for a general check because Sarah had insisted, and once for a minor cut on the boy's hand. The schoolhouse held Miss Bauer, who had taken both children in without fanfare, and within a week had told Sarah that Lily was one of the most capable readers she'd seen at her age. "And," Jack said, "Dr. Hennessy will testify," Sarah said. "He's already documented Ethan's health when he first examined him and compared it to now. He said the record is—" She paused, choosing the word carefully, "unambiguous." "Good. Miss Bauer will also speak," she said. Sarah stopped again. This pause was different. She was braced against something. She said she should have said something sooner, about how Lily talked about the last few months in town. Things she mentioned without knowing she was telling on them. She exhaled once sharp. 8 years old, and she'd been carrying all of it. Jack said nothing. He understood that she needed a moment, not a response. "I also went to see Reverend Cole," Sarah continued, back in control of her voice. "He wasn't home, but his wife was." A small, complicated expression. "Margaret Cole is going to be more useful than her husband, I think." "Margaret Cole talks to everyone," Jack said. "Exactly." He looked at her. This woman, who had climbed out of the boarding house in Harlan Creek with 2 children and nothing but the shape of her own spine to hold her up, who had come to his ranch. Not because she'd given up, but because she'd made a strategic decision, who had spent a day while he was riding fence lines, quietly building the architecture of their defense. He looked at her and felt something settle in him that he hadn't realized was unsettled. "You didn't have to do this alone," he said. "I know," she said, "but I needed to know I could." He understood that completely. He didn't say so because he didn't think she needed to hear it from him. He just nodded and got out of the doorway so she could get to the stove. The hearing was 9 days away when the first real blow landed. It came in the form of a man named Silas Croft, who was the county recorder and who was, as Jack would learn through Cal's network, a business associate of Harold Pierce's, with a debt to him that had never been formally settled, but was understood between them as a standing obligation. Silas Croft sent a notice that the hearing had been moved, not the date, the venue. Instead of the county seat, which was 30 miles north, the hearing would now be held in Harlan Creek itself, in the courthouse that Harold Pierce had helped fund 12 years earlier, and whose walls carried his name on a brass plate by the front door. Cal brought the notice to Jack in the barn. Jack read it twice slowly, which was the way he read things he needed to understand completely before reacting to. Then he folded it. "He wants home ground," Jack said. "He wants the audience," Cal said. "Harlan Creek. Everybody who signed that petition. Everybody who's been talking for weeks. He wants her to walk into a room that's already decided." Jack was quiet for a moment. "Then we make sure the room hasn't decided. How do you plan to do that?" "By making sure everyone who hasn't talked yet has a reason to." He went to Sarah. He knocked on the door to the quarters. He always knocked, had made a point of it from the first day, because she needed that boundary clearly maintained, and he respected it, and she opened it, and he told her about the venue change. She took it the same way she took most bad news, which was to get very still and very quiet for a moment while she processed it, and then to ask the practical question. "Does it change what we can bring to the hearing?" "No," he said. "Same rules, different room." "Then it changes nothing important," she said. He almost smiled. "No," he agreed. "It doesn't. But it did change one thing, and he knew it, even if she was holding herself too carefully to admit it. It changed the way the day would feel. Walking into that courthouse in Harlan Creek, past the people who had watched her children eat scraps behind a diner, past the women who had whispered, and the men who had taken bets at the livery. That was a different thing than walking into a neutral room 30 miles away. That was a gauntlet. And gauntlets were designed to make you hesitate before you reached the end of them. He was thinking about this 4 days later when Ethan came and found him in the stable. The boy had developed the habit of appearing wherever Jack was working, watching for a while without speaking, and then asking one extremely specific question that had clearly been brewing for some time. Jack had adapted to this. He kept working and waited for the question. "Are they going to take us away?" Ethan asked. Jack set down what he was holding. He turned and looked at the boy, who was standing with his hands in his pockets and his chin level, doing an excellent imitation of a person who was not frightened, which Jack recognized because he had been performing the same imitation at a different age. "Who told you about the hearing?" he asked. "Nobody. I heard Mama talking to Mrs. Agnes." Ethan's jaw tightened in a way that looked startlingly like his mother. "Are they?" Jack considered the options. He could soften it. He could deflect. He could offer the kind of vague reassurance that adults gave children when the truth was complicated and the adults themselves weren't certain. He rejected all three. "Not if I have anything to say about it," he said. "What if you don't have enough to say?" "Then your mama will," Jack said. "And between the two of us, we've got a fair amount." Ethan thought about this. "Lily cried last night," he said in a lower voice. "She thought I was asleep. I wasn't." "I know. She doesn't cry in front of Mama. She thinks it'll upset her." "Your sister's protecting your mother," Jack said. "The same way your mother's been protecting both of you." Ethan looked at the ground and then back up. "Who's protecting Mama?" he asked. The question landed with a quietness that was heavier than volume. Jack held the boy's gaze and answered with the same directness Ethan had used to ask. "I am," he said. "That's what I'm doing right now." Ethan studied him for a long moment, with those serious dark eyes that seemed to take in more than a 6-year-old should reasonably be taking in. Then he nodded once with the gravity of someone who had received information and filed it appropriately. He went back outside without saying anything else. Jack stood in the stable for a moment after he left and breathed carefully. The night before the hearing, he found Sarah on the porch. She was sitting in the dark with a shawl around her shoulders and her hands folded in her lap, and she wasn't doing anything, which was unusual enough that it stopped him in the doorway. He couldn't remember seeing Sarah Whitmore simply sitting without working at something. He moved outside and stood at the railing a few feet from her. "Couldn't sleep," she said without looking at him. No. The night sounds of the ranch filled the space between them. Horses shifting in the stable wind, coming off the mountains, the distant low of cattle in the far pasture. He had spent 20 years on this land, and these sounds were as familiar to him as his own breathing. "I keep thinking," she said quietly, "about all the ways it could still go wrong." "That's what your mind does the night before," he said. "It runs every bad road." "Does yours?" He leaned on the railing. "Every time." She was quiet for a moment. "What do you do with it?" "Remind myself I've done everything I can do tonight, and that tomorrow starts fresh regardless." She exhaled. "That sounds simple." "It isn't," he said, "but it's true." She turned to look at him. Then, for the first time since he'd come outside, and in the dark, her face was unguarded, in a way it rarely was when there was any light to be seen by. He could see the fear she kept under the composure. He could see the exhaustion that she managed so well during the day that most people didn't realize it was there. He could see something else too, something he wasn't going to name tonight, because tonight was not the night for naming things. "Jack," she said. The first time she had used his given name, she either didn't notice or didn't remark on it. "Sarah. Whatever happens tomorrow..." She stopped, started again. "Whatever happens, I want you to know that what you did, taking us in, it wasn't nothing. It wasn't a small thing. And I don't say that so you'll feel good about yourself. I say it because I don't think anyone's told you lately that something you did mattered." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're wrong," he said quietly. "Someone just did." She held his gaze in the dark. Then she turned back toward the mountains, and they sat in silence for a while longer. Two people who had both carried too much alone for too long, sitting close enough that the distance between them was no longer the distance it had been at the start. And then dawn came up over the mountains cold and clear, and it was time. Jack dressed without thinking about it, moving through the familiar motions of a man preparing for something he intended to win. He came downstairs and found Sarah already at the stove, already dressed, already working because she was always already working, and Ethan and Lily were at the table, in their best clothes, quiet and straight-backed, understanding, without being told that today was the kind of day that required their best selves. Cal was waiting outside with the wagon and 2 riders from the ranch. Sarah saw the riders and looked at Jack. "In case anyone gets ideas about making the road difficult," he said simply. She looked at the riders. She looked at him. "You thought of everything," she said. "I tried to," he said. She picked up her shawl, squared her shoulders, and walked out the door. What waited for them in Harlan Creek was exactly what Jack had prepared for, and exactly what Sarah had dreaded. The street outside the courthouse was lined with people, some of them witnesses, some of them merely there to watch, and the watching faces were not all friendly. Harold Pierce's wagon was already there, prominent positioned where it could be seen. Harold himself stood on the courthouse steps with the satisfied expression of a man who had arranged the furniture to his advantage and was ready to receive guests. He saw Sarah coming, and he smiled. Sarah saw the smile and did not slow down. She walked straight up those courthouse steps with her children beside her and her spine like iron, and Jack Dawson one step behind, and she did not look at Harold Pierce, except once briefly directly without expression, before she pushed open the courthouse door and walked inside. The room beyond was already full, and at the back of it something Jack had not expected, had not arranged for, had not asked for, something that shifted the air in the room the moment he saw it. A row of women. Women from Harlan Creek. Women he recognized. Women who had never once to his knowledge stood up for anything publicly in their lives. Sitting in the back row of the courthouse, with their hands folded and their faces set, and their presence saying everything their mouths hadn't said yet. He didn't know who had talked to them. He would find out later it was Margaret Cole, the Reverend's wife, who had spent 3 days going door to door in Harlan Creek, having conversations that Jack Dawson's money and influence could never have had. He found Sarah's arm and leaned close. "Back row," he said quietly. She looked. Her breath caught. Just slightly. Just for a moment. Then she straightened her spine, took her children's hands, and walked to the front of the room to face whatever came next. Harold Pierce walked in behind them, still smiling. But when he scanned the room and saw the back row, the smile changed. Not gone, but different. The smile of a man who had walked into a room expecting one thing and found the arithmetic had shifted. The commissioner called the hearing to order, and Sarah Whitmore, who had eaten leftovers behind a diner 6 weeks ago and been told in 100 different ways that she was not enough, sat down and prepared to prove every single one of them wrong. Commissioner Aldous Webb called the hearing to order with a single knock of his gavel, and the room went quiet. The way rooms went quiet when everyone present understood that something real was about to happen. Webb was 60 years old, gray-haired, with the careful expression of a man who had spent decades trying to be fair in a county that didn't always reward fairness. Jack had dealt with him twice before, once over a water rights dispute, once over a property line that a neighbor had tried to redraw after a few too many drinks and a bad survey. Both times, Webb had ruled on the evidence and not on whoever had more friends in the room. That was all Jack was counting on today. That, and the women in the back row, and the witnesses they had spent 12 days assembling, and the truth which he had always believed was a more durable material than most people gave it credit for. Harold Pierce sat at the petitioner's table with his attorney, a man named Greer, who had sharp eyes and an expensive coat, and the practiced ease of someone who made his living in rooms like this one. Pierce had arranged himself at the table the way he arranged himself everywhere, with the air of a man who already knew the ending and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. Sarah sat at the opposite table with her hands folded and her back straight. Ethan and Lily were in the front row behind her, Agnes sitting between them with a hand on each child's knee. Jack sat beside Sarah, which was not something either of them had discussed in advance. He had simply sat down next to her when they reached the table, and she had looked at him sideways for a moment, and then looked forward without a word. He took that as acceptance. Greer opened for Pierce with a prepared statement that was 17 minutes long and clinically precise, in the way that cruelty was often most effective not through exaggeration, but through selection. He presented the facts of Sarah's situation, stripped of every human context that might explain them. The debts, the lost house, the diner work that had ended, the move to the Dawson Ranch under what he described with careful delicacy as circumstances that raised reasonable questions in the minds of reasonable people. He read from the signed statements of the 11 petitioners, each one a stripped and flattened version of a woman he was describing as unfit. Jack watched Sarah's face during all of it. She didn't move. She didn't react. She watched Greer the way she watched everything that was difficult directly, without flinching, without giving it the satisfaction of making her look away. He had seen that particular kind of composure before, and he knew what it cost. He knew she was paying for it in the moment and would be paying for it later in the dark when the children were asleep and there was nobody who needed her spine to be iron anymore. When Greer finished, Webb asked if the petitioner wished to call witnesses. Greer called Mrs. Hooper first. This was, Jack recognized, intentional. Mrs. Hooper was the kind of witness who established atmosphere rather than facts. She knew how to make a room feel a certain way before the evidence was presented, knew how to calibrate an audience, knew how to perform righteousness with enough conviction that it looked like integrity. She sat in the witness chair with her hands folded and her chin elevated and confirmed everything the petition alleged in the specific tone of a woman who regretted very deeply that things had come to this, but felt a moral obligation to speak. Jack had been in enough negotiations to know what Pierce was doing. He was trying to set the temperature of the room before the facts arrived so that the facts would be received in an atmosphere he had already arranged. When Greer sat down and Webb looked to Jack's side of the room, Jack leaned slightly toward the man he had brought to handle the legal matter, a county attorney named Ruddle, who was not as expensive as Greer and was significantly more honest. Ruddle stood and began the cross-examination of Mrs. Hooper with a single question. "Mrs. Hooper, did you ever personally witness Sarah Whitmore fail to care for her children?" A pause. "I witnessed the situation she put them in. That wasn't my question. Did you personally with your own eyes witness Sarah Whitmore fail to care for her children?" Another pause, longer. "I saw the condition they were in." "The condition," Ruddell said, "that resulted from her husband's death medical bills and the loss of their home. Not from neglect." He paused. "You signed a statement saying she was unfit. Can you tell the commissioner one specific action you witnessed that you would characterize as neglect?" The silence that followed was 11 seconds long. Jack counted. "She allowed them to eat behind the diner," Mrs. Hooper said finally. "She allowed them to eat," Ruddell repeated with a flatness that made the room understand what had just been said. "Thank you." Pierce's expression didn't change, but something around his eyes did. A very small adjustment. Jack filed it. Greer called 2 more witnesses, a man named Burton, who had lived next to Sarah's old house and claimed she had kept irregular hours, and a woman who sat on the church committee and said she had concerns without being able to specify what they were when asked directly. Each time Ruddell cross-examined with the same surgical patience. By the third witness, the room had shifted its weight. Barely. But Jack had spent enough time reading rooms to feel it. Then Webb called for the respondents' witnesses. Ruddell called Dr. Hennessy first. The doctor was a precise man who spoke in the careful, measured language of someone accustomed to being quoted and understood the importance of saying exactly what he meant and nothing else. He described Ethan's condition at the time of his first examination, the signs of consistent undereating, the fatigue, the slightly delayed responsiveness in a boy who should have been vibrating with 6-year-old energy. Then he described Ethan's condition now, 4 weeks later at the ranch. He used numbers. He used specific clinical observations. He did not editorialize. He didn't need to. The numbers editorialized for him. Greer cross-examined and tried to suggest that the improvement proved not that Sarah was a good mother, but simply that better material conditions produced better outcomes, which wasn't necessarily a comment on her fitness. Hennessy looked at Greer over the top of his glasses. "A child in the condition Ethan Whitmore was in when I first examined him got to that condition through chronic, consistent deprivation. That deprivation was not the result of his mother's neglect. It was the result of poverty following catastrophic loss. Those are not the same thing, and any physician who told you otherwise would be lying." He paused. "Would you like me to explain the clinical difference?" Greer would not. Miss Bauer came next. She was young, perhaps 25, with the earnest intensity of a woman who had come into teaching because she genuinely believed children were worth the effort. She described Lily. She talked about a girl who was reading 2 years above her level and who had in her first week at the new school written an essay that Miss Bauer had kept because she hadn't been able to bring herself to hand it back. She said that in the essay, Lily had written about her mother, about watching her mother work, about what she had understood at 8 years old of what her mother was doing and why. "What did she write specifically?" Webb asked. He had leaned forward slightly. Jack noticed. Miss Bauer reached into her jacket and produced a folded paper. She wrote, and here her voice changed slightly the way voices changed when they were reading something that had already gotten under the skin. "My mama works even when she's tired, and she thinks I don't see her, but I do. She doesn't eat her food sometimes, but she always makes sure we have ours. I think that's what love is, doing the hard thing when no one's looking." The room was completely still. In the front row, Agnes pressed her hand a little more firmly on Ethan's knee. The boy was looking at the table, his jaw tight in the way his mother's went tight when she was holding something in. Lily was looking at her hands. Sarah was looking straight ahead, and she was not blinking, and Jack could see the effort that was costing her. He reached under the table and covered her hand with his for exactly 3 seconds. Then he moved it back. She didn't look at him, but her shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch, and that was enough. Margaret Cole was the third witness, and she was, as Jack had suspected, she would be the one that changed the room completely. She was 63 years old, and she had lived in Harlan Creek for 40 of those years, and she did not give the impression of a woman who had come to be cross-examined. She sat in the witness chair like she was sitting in her own parlor, and when Riddell asked her to describe her knowledge of Sarah Whitmore, she turned slightly and addressed not just Riddell, but the entire room. "I'm going to say something that I should have said a long time ago," she said, "and I'll ask the commissioner's patience because I think it needs to be said before anything else." She looked at Webb. He nodded. She continued, "This town failed Sarah Whitmore. We watched her husband die, and we came to the funeral, and we left. We watched her lose the house, and we said to each other that it was a shame. We watched her children in the state they were in, and we whispered about it, and we did nothing because it was easier to decide she had done something wrong than to admit that we had." The room did not stir. Not a cough, not a shift of weight. "Harold Pierce wants you to look at this woman and see a problem," Margaret Cole said. "I'm asking you to look at her and see what she actually is, which is the only mother those 2 children have, and a better one than most of this room deserved to have, defending her children in front of them today." Greer rose. "Commissioner, I object to the characterization." "Noted," Webb said without looking at Greer. "Continue, Mrs. Cole." Margaret Cole continued for 4 more minutes, and by the time she was finished, the back row of women were no longer sitting quite so quietly. 2 of them had their hands pressed over their mouths. One was crying silently and making no effort to stop. Then it was Sarah's turn. She walked to the witness chair with the same measured step she used for everything, not hesitant, not performative, simply forward. She sat. She looked at Webb. She looked at Greer. She looked at Harold Pierce, who looked back at her with an expression that had shifted considerably from the smile on the courthouse steps. Riddell began quietly. "Mrs. Whitmore, tell the commissioner in your own words what the last year has been." Sarah was silent for a moment. Then she spoke. She didn't perform grief. She didn't ask for sympathy. She told it the way she lived everything directly without decoration, with the specific concrete details of a woman who understood that truth was more powerful when it was specific. She described the morning Daniel died. She described the 60 days with the bank. She described the 3 jobs and the meals she hadn't eaten and the nights she had sewn by lamplight. She described the morning the furniture went out to the road and her children had stood on the porch, and she had told them it was going to be all right, and she had not known if that was true, but she had said it because they needed to hear it, and because she was their mother, and that was what mothers did. She described the afternoon behind the diner. "My son fell asleep holding a piece of chicken," she said, "a piece that someone else had left. He was 6 years old, and he was hungry, and I could not fix that in that moment, and there is not a day that will pass for the rest of my life that I won't carry that." She paused. "But I want to be clear about something. My children were not suffering because I failed them. They were suffering because we had lost everything through no fault of anyone living, and because the people around us decided it was easier to judge than to help. I kept working. I kept trying. I skipped my own meals and took on more work than my body could hold, because I was not going to let my children go without if there was any way to prevent it." Her voice was completely steady. "That is not negligence. That is a mother." The room was silent enough that Jack could hear someone in the back row exhale. Greer stood for cross-examination with the body language of a man who had revised his strategy mid-hearing and was now navigating by instinct. He tried 3 angles. He asked about the circumstances of her moving to the ranch. She answered without defensiveness and without elaboration, factually plainly. He tried to imply financial dependence. She told him her wage and her duties and the terms of her employment with the precision of a woman who had anticipated this question and kept records. He tried finally the question that was the whole point, that the arrangement was improper, that her presence in Jack Dawson's household was not purely professional. Sarah looked at him without expression. "What exactly are you alleging, Mr. Greer?" "I'm simply asking." "You're implying," she said. "I'd like you to say it plainly if you're going to say it." Greer looked at his papers. "No further questions." There was movement in the back row. Not noise. Just movement, the involuntary physical response of a group of people who had just seen something that satisfied them. Then Jack stood. Ruddle had not planned to call him. They hadn't discussed it. Jack simply stood up and Ruddle looked at him, and Jack said quietly, "I need to say something," and Ruddle, who was a practical man, sat down. Webb looked at Jack. "Mr. Dawson, you're not a listed witness." "No," Jack said. "But I have relevant testimony, and I believe the commissioner has discretion about additional witnesses." Webb studied him for a moment. Harold Pierce across the room said nothing, and his silence was the silence of a man calculating odds very rapidly. "I'll allow it," Webb said. "Keep it to what's relevant." Jack walked to the witness chair. He sat down. He looked at the room, the commissioners, the audience, the back row, Harold Pierce, and finally Sarah, who was watching him with an expression he could not entirely read, except that it was very focused and very still. He had not planned what he was going to say. That was unlike him. He was a man who planned. But some things couldn't be planned, and this was one of them, and he trusted that the truth would arrive in the right order if he started from the right place. 20 years ago, he said, "my sister Rebecca was widowed. She had a daughter 4 years old. She had no money and no family nearby, and she was in a town that treated her the way this town has treated Sarah Whitmore." His voice was level. He didn't let it shake. He made himself keep it level because if it shook he wouldn't finish, and he needed to finish. People said she wasn't managing well enough. They said her situation was her own fault. They talked about her the way men talked about women who needed help and didn't deserve it, which is the ugliest kind of talking there is. He paused. "I was far away. I got the letter 3 weeks after she died. She was 31 years old. The room had the quality of held breath. I have spent 20 years knowing that I couldn't have gotten there in time," Jack said, "and 20 years knowing that the people around her could have helped and didn't. That's a different thing. That lives in a different place." He looked at Harold Pierce. "You filed a petition claiming this woman is unfit. I want to tell you what I have watched her do in 6 weeks on my property. I have watched her work before sunrise and after dark without being asked to. I have watched her give my household more order and care than it has had in years. I have watched her children go from hungry and frightened to fed and laughing, not because I provided for them, but because she used every resource she had to make sure they were safe and loved every single day." He stopped. When he continued, his voice was quieter, but it didn't waver. "This petition is not about those children's welfare. Everyone in this room who is being honest with themselves knows that. This petition is about punishing a woman for surviving, when some people would have preferred she didn't, and for accepting help when the people who should have offered it didn't." He looked at Webb. "That's all I have." He walked back to the table. Sarah was looking at her hands when he sat down. He couldn't see her face, but he could see her shoulders, and they were shaking very slightly with the contained effort of someone who was not going to cry in this room in front of these people, and he respected that so completely that he looked away and gave her the privacy of it. Webb called a recess of 20 minutes. During the recess, Harold Pierce crossed the room for the first time. He stopped in front of Jack and said in a low voice that didn't carry, "You've made an enemy today." Jack looked at him. "You made one when you filed against her," he said. "I just confirmed it." Pierce held his gaze for a moment, then walked away. The 20 minutes were the longest Jack could remember in recent history. Ethan had climbed into Sarah's lap during the recess, which he was technically too old for, and which neither of them acknowledged, and Lily had taken her mother's hand and held it in both of hers, and was talking to her in a low, continuous murmur that Jack couldn't hear and didn't try to. Agnes stood nearby with her arms folded, radiating the particular protective energy of a woman who had decided that nothing else was getting through to this family today. Webb returned. The room resettled. Webb looked at his papers. He looked at the room. He looked at Harold Pierce's table, and at Sarah's table, and at the back row, which had not thinned during the recess, but had, if anything, added 2 more women to its number. "Before I give my findings," Webb said, "I want to say something that is not part of the official record, but that I believe needs to be said in this room by someone with standing to say it." He set his papers down. "A petition of this nature, alleging unfitness on the basis of poverty and circumstance rather than demonstrated harm, is a misuse of this process. It causes damage regardless of outcome. It caused damage to this woman and these children before we ever convened today. The people of this county should understand that the purpose of these proceedings is the protection of children, not the punishment of parents for surviving difficult circumstances." Pierce's attorney began to rise. Webb looked at him and he sat back down. "The petition," Webb said, "is dismissed. The children remain with their mother. Full custody is affirmed." He knocked the gavel once. "We're adjourned." The room erupted, not into chaos, into the specific released energy of a room that had been holding its breath and finally let it go. The back row women were on their feet. The sound was not cheering exactly, more like exhaling, like the collective release of something that had been compressed for too long. Harold Pierce stood, said something short to Greer, and walked out of the courthouse without looking at anyone. Jack watched him go and felt nothing that resembled satisfaction, because Pierce would recalibrate and he would find another angle, and that was something Jack would need to be ready for. But that was a problem for another day. He turned to Sarah. She was standing. Ethan was still pressed against her side, his arms around her waist, and Lily had her face buried against her mother's shoulder, and Sarah had one arm around each of them, and she was looking at Jack over the tops of their heads with an expression that said everything she didn't have words for. In this moment, the relief and the anger and the exhaustion and something else. Something that had been building for 6 weeks, and that Jack recognized because he was feeling it too. He crossed to them. He didn't say anything. He put his hand on Sarah's shoulder. Just for a moment, and she pressed her cheek briefly against the back of his hand before she straightened, and that was all. And it was enough, and everyone in the room who was watching could interpret it however they chose. Agnes was crying openly. Cal, who had arrived at some point during the recess and was standing near the back, had his hat in his hands and was looking at the floor with the expression of a man carefully managing his own feelings. Margaret Cole made her way through the crowd to Sarah and took both her hands. "I should have come sooner," she said. "I'm sorry." Sarah looked at her. "You came," she said. "That's what matters." Outside, the September sun had turned the street gold, and the crowd from the courthouse was spilling out onto the steps. And somewhere in the noise, Ethan had gotten loose and was running in small circles on the courthouse lawn with his arms out, which was the most 6-year-old thing Jack had seen him do since the boy arrived at the ranch, and it was so ordinary and so right that it stopped him on the steps for a moment. He stood there and watched Ethan run. And then Sarah was beside him, not touching, just standing close enough that he could feel the warmth of her in the cool autumn air, and she said quietly, "It's over." "This part," he said. She looked at him. "This part," she agreed. And they stood together on the courthouse steps while Ethan ran, and Lily laughed at her brother, and the town of Harlan Creek went on around them, rearranging itself, already beginning the slow and necessary work of deciding what it believed about itself, now that the truth had been said out loud in a room with official walls. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, in the way that only came after something enormous had passed through. Ethan fell asleep against Sarah's arm before they cleared the edge of town, which was the most honest possible response to the day his body simply decided it was done, and checked out without consulting anyone. Lily stayed awake, sitting very still, watching the road ahead, with the expression she got when she was processing something that was too large for her current vocabulary. She didn't ask questions. She just watched and thought, and eventually leaned her head against her mother's shoulder without saying anything at all. Sarah let her. Jack rode alongside the wagon for most of the journey without speaking. Cal drove. Agnes sat in the back and kept one hand resting lightly on Ethan's leg, the way she did with her own grandchildren, which she had never mentioned to Jack, but which he had noticed, because he noticed most things about the people who had stayed with him long enough to become something like family. It was Agnes who broke the silence about halfway back, and she did it the way she did everything, without ceremony and without apology. "That woman Cole," she said. "Somebody should have listened to her a long time ago." "Yes," Sarah said. "She'll be listened to now," Agnes said. "For what it's worth." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "It's worth something," she said finally. "I don't know how much yet, but something." They got back to the ranch as the light was going amber and long across the fields. Ethan woke up when the wagon stopped and looked around with the briefly confused expression of someone reassembling their location, and then he climbed down and immediately went to check on Chester through the fence at a respectful distance, which Jack chose to interpret as a sign of psychological recovery. Lily helped Agnes carry things inside. Sarah stood by the wagon for a moment after everyone else had moved, not going anywhere, just standing. Jack dismounted and handed his horse off to one of the hands and walked back to where she was. She didn't say anything. He stood beside her and looked at the same middle distance she was looking at, and waited because he had learned that Sarah Whitmore needed to arrive at the thing she wanted to say in her own time, and that trying to move her faster produced nothing useful. "I keep waiting for the other boot to drop," she said. "It might," he said. "Pierce doesn't let things go easily." "I know," she exhaled. "But that's not, I don't mean Pierce. I mean—" She stopped, tried again. "I have spent a year waiting for everything to get worse. It became a habit. And now I'm standing here, and today went the way it went, and I don't know how to stop waiting." He thought about that. "It takes a while," he said. "The waiting. It doesn't stop all at once. It just gets quieter over time until one day you realize it's been a week since you expected the worst." She turned to look at him. "How long did it take you?" He met her eyes. "Ask me again in a year," he said. Something moved across her face. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was something that occupied the same space where smiles came from, and he counted it. "All right," she said, and she went inside. The week that followed was the most ordinary week the ranch had known since Jack could clearly remember. Ordinary in the way that things became ordinary after crisis, not boring, but grounded each day, having the specific texture of real life rather than the strange suspended quality of waiting for a verdict. Sarah ran the household with the same focused efficiency she had brought to it from the beginning, except that now there was something underneath the efficiency that hadn't been there before. A looseness barely perceptible. A willingness to set something down before it was completely finished if one of the children needed her. Small things. But Jack noticed them all. Ethan discovered that Chester, observed from a distance of at least 4 feet, was actually quite interesting, and began spending part of each afternoon conducting what he described as research. Lily asked Miss Bauer if she could borrow 2 extra books, which Miss Bauer apparently found so gratifying that she sent home 3. The house had the sound of children in it, in a way it never had before, and Jack moved through that sound the way you moved through weather you had forgotten you'd been missing, adjusting without quite being aware you were adjusting to a new atmosphere. Harold Pierce was not done. Jack had known this. He'd said as much to Sarah on the courthouse steps. Pierce was a man who processed loss as strategy, not as conclusion, and the only question was what form the next move would take, and how long he would wait before making it. The answer was 11 days. Cal brought him the information on a Wednesday morning with the particular set to his expression that meant the news was significant, and he'd already thought through the angles. Pierce had filed a complaint with the state land office. The complaint alleged irregularities in the northern boundary survey of Jack's property, a survey that had been conducted and registered 15 years ago, and that Jack had the original documents for in his own office. "This isn't about the survey," Jack said. "No," Cal agreed. "It's about cost. He's going to make everything expensive. The legal response, the time, the attention. He's going to make running this ranch while defending your property more difficult than it should be, and he's going to keep doing it until you either make a mistake or decide it's not worth it." Jack looked at the complaint. He looked at Cal. "What's it going to take to put him down permanently?" Cal was quiet for a moment. "Probably someone with more patience than Pierce, and more reach than he expects." "I have patience," Jack said. "I know," Cal said. "That's why I'm still here after 15 years. He dealt with the survey complaint that week. It took 2 days and a letter from his own surveyor, and was dismissed before it reached any official hearing, but he understood that it was the first of what Pierce intended to be many. A campaign of attrition. The tactic of a man who couldn't win directly and knew it. What Jack hadn't anticipated was that Sarah would find out about it before he'd decided how to tell her. She came to him in the late afternoon 2 days after the complaint was dismissed, and she had the look on her face that meant she had already worked through the initial reaction and was now operating in the clear, cold space on the other side of it. "Agnes told me," she said, "about Pierce and the survey." He didn't ask Agnes why she'd told her. Agnes had her own judgment about what Sarah needed to know, and he had enough respect for Agnes's judgment not to second-guess it. "It's handled," he said. "This time," Sarah said. "What about the next time?" "Also handled, and the time after that." She looked at him steadily. "Jack, I need to know if bringing us here has cost you things I didn't know about. I need you to be honest with me about that." He considered lying not to spare himself, but to spare her, and then discarded it because she deserved better, and he knew it. "He's going to keep making things difficult," he said. "For a while. It'll cost time and some money and a fair amount of aggravation. None of it will break anything that matters." "Are you certain?" "I'm certain that nothing Harold Pierce can file will take this ranch," he said. "And I'm certain that the only way I'll regret any of it is if you decide the cost to you is too high and leave. That's the only outcome I'm not prepared for." She held his gaze for a long, still moment. "Why?" she said. "Be honest." And here it was. The thing that had been building for 6 weeks in the space between them, in the silences and the early mornings, and the 3 seconds under the table at the hearing and the night on the porch, when she had used his given name for the first time. It was here, and they were both standing in it, and there was no useful reason to step back from it anymore. "Because this house has been quiet for 20 years, he said, "and now it isn't. Because your son talks to my bull through the fence, and your daughter leaves her books on my chair, and you are the only person in recent memory who has told me that something I did mattered." He stopped, steadied himself, continued. "And because I have been trying very hard to be practical and appropriate about all of it, and I am finding it increasingly difficult." She was very still. "Increasingly difficult," she repeated. "Yes." "How difficult?" "Sarah," he said. And the way he said her name was not the way he had said it the night on the porch, or at the hearing, or at any other point in the 6 weeks she had been here. It was the way you said someone's name when it had become something more than a name. When it had become the word you reached for when everything else ran out. She took 1 step toward him. Just one. "I buried my husband 4 months ago," she said. "And I am still learning what that means, who I am in the aftermath of that. I am not the same woman I was when Daniel was alive. I don't know yet who this woman is." She searched his face. "I need you to know that before anything else." "I know it," he said. "It's not simple." "No, and I have 2 children who have already had one world taken from them, and I will not let them be moved again, unless I am certain, completely certain, that where they are is where they are staying." "I understand that," he said. "I'm not asking you for anything you're not ready to give. I'm telling you how things are so you can decide what you want to do with it, on your own terms, in your own time." She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light was coming through the window, the way it did at this hour, all gold and long shadows, and he could hear Ethan outside calling something to Cal about Chester and Lily's voice drifting from somewhere in the house, and the ranch making its familiar sounds around them, like a world that had already accepted all of this and was simply waiting for the people in it to catch up. "My own terms," she said quietly. "In my own time." Yes, she nodded once, slowly. And then she reached out and touched his hand, not the way he had touched hers at the hearing, briefly, strategically, but the way people touched things they were deciding to keep. She held it for a moment and then let go and stepped back and looked at him with clear eyes. "All right," she said. "Then give me time." "You have all of it," he said. 3 months passed. They were not easy months, and they were not uncomplicated ones because nothing worth having was either of those things. Pierce filed 2 more complaints, both dismissed. A man from the county rode out to inspect the property in November on a pretext that Jack's attorney described as the thinnest he had seen in 30 years of practice, and Jack walked him around the entire ranch for 4 hours until the man was satisfied and somewhat embarrassed and did not come back. Cal took to referring to these events as the Tuesday inconveniences, which reduced them to an appropriate size. The winter came early and hard, the way Montana winters always did, arriving without apology and settling in with the confidence of a long-term resident. The house filled with the specific warmth of a household that was functioning real meals, real fires, the ongoing low-grade chaos of 2 children who had figured out that this was home and were acting accordingly. Ethan had stopped watching the door. Jack noticed it on a Tuesday in December, the way you notice things that had changed gradually, not at the moment of change, but at some later moment when the absence of the old thing became visible. For weeks after they'd arrived, Ethan had watched the door with the eyes of a child who had learned that security was temporary and was monitoring for the moment it ended. And then at some point, Jack couldn't pinpoint when he had stopped. He ate his meals and ran his circuits around the yard and conducted his Chester research and slept without appearing to wonder if everything would be different in the morning. Jack mentioned it to Sarah one evening after the children were in bed. She was in the kitchen doing the last of the day's work, which was always the moment he found it easiest to talk to her, when the day was almost done and the defenses were down slightly and there was nothing requiring performance from either of them. "I noticed," she said. She was quiet for a moment. Lily, too. She stopped giving Ethan half her food at meals. Her voice was carefully steady. She did it for months. Even after we got here, when there was plenty, she'd still slide things onto his plate when she thought no one was looking. She stopped about 3 weeks ago. Jack leaned against the doorframe. "You noticed 3 weeks ago." "I cried about it," she said, "which I know sounds strange." "It doesn't," he said. "It sounds like a mother who knows what it meant." She put down what she was holding and turned to face him. "She didn't need to protect him anymore," Sarah said. "That's what it meant. She stopped being a small, frightened person trying to hold everything together, and she went back to being 8 years old." Her voice cracked just slightly on the last word, and she pressed her lips together for a moment. "I had no idea how much I needed to see that." He crossed the kitchen and stood in front of her. Not close enough to crowd her, not far enough to be distant. The space he had been learning to calibrate these past months with the care of someone who understood that the right distance was the one she set, and that it was his job to hold to whatever she gave. "Sarah," he said. She looked up at him. Her eyes were bright. She didn't look away. "I know it's not time yet," he said. "I'm not saying it's time. But I want you to know that whatever time you need, another month, another year longer, it doesn't change what this is. For me." She held his gaze. "It's changing for me," she said quietly. "What it is. I feel it changing, and it frightens me. Not because of what it's becoming." She searched for the word. "Because of how much I want it. I didn't expect to want anything again. Not like this." "I know," he said. "Do you? I've been watching you for 3 months," he said. "I know." She laughed, which startled both of them because it was sudden and real and unguarded, the laugh of a woman who had been surprised into it. And then she put her hand flat against his chest, not his hand this time, his chest over his heartbeat, and felt him breathe for a moment. "Jack," she said. "Sarah." "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "I want you to know that. Whatever else, whatever time I need, I am not going anywhere." He covered her hand with his. "Neither am I." Spring came. It came the way spring always came to Montana suddenly, after months of winter that had started to feel permanent. One morning the air was different, and everything that had been locked up started moving again. The fields greened. The cattle moved. Ethan found 3 separate things in the first week that he needed Jack to look at immediately, and Jack looked at all of them with the seriousness they deserved, which was considerable, because Ethan was a boy who did not bring things to your attention frivolously. The answer to what had been building between Jack and Sarah arrived not with ceremony, but with the ordinary momentum of a life that had become, without their quite deciding on it, a shared one. It was a Sunday morning in April. Sarah had made breakfast, and the table was loud in the way it was now reliably loud. Ethan narrating something about a hawk. He had seen Lily correcting his bird identification with the serenity of someone who had recently read extensively on the subject. Agnes pretending not to be entertained by all of it. Jack sat at the head of the table and drank his coffee, and listened to his house be full of people, and felt something he could only describe as the specific satisfaction of a thing finally being what it was supposed to be. After breakfast, when the children had gone outside, and Agnes had found reasons to be elsewhere, he found Sarah at the kitchen table with her hands around her coffee cup and her face turned toward the window. He sat across from her. She looked at him. The morning light was in her eyes, and she didn't look away from it, or from him, and he thought not for the first time that she was the bravest person he had ever known. Not because she didn't feel fear, but because she met it head-on, and dealt with it, and kept moving, which was the only kind of courage that actually cost anything. "I've been thinking," she said, about what you said, in your own terms, in your own time." She looked at her coffee, then back at him. "I think I know what I want. I've known for a while. I was making sure." She met his eyes. "I needed to be sure it wasn't gratitude, or relief, or needing somewhere safe. I needed to know it was the actual thing." "Is it?" he said. "Yes," she said, simply, without qualification. "It is." He reached across the table. She took his hand. Outside, Ethan was yelling something at Cal about a fence, and Lily's voice floated through the window, reading something aloud to herself. And the ranch was making all its familiar sounds. Horses and wind and the distant creek, and the world going about its business. And inside at the kitchen table of a house that had been quiet for 20 years, 2 people held hands in the morning light and understood, without needing to say it, that the shape of things had permanently changed. He asked her that afternoon. Not on a knee, not with ceremony, because neither of them were people of ceremony. He asked her standing by the fence where Ethan had been conducting his Chester research in the late afternoon, when the light went gold, and the children were somewhere in the middle distance, and Cal and Agnes were in the bunkhouse being diplomatically absent. He asked her plainly. He told her what he wanted, and why he wanted it, and what he intended to build, and he said that she could say no, and he would still be the same man tomorrow morning, that he was right now no different, no lesser. That her answer didn't change the ground she stood on, that he was asking because he wanted to, not because he needed her to complete anything about himself. She listened to all of it without interrupting, which was how she listened to everything important. Then she said yes, not dramatically, not with tears, though her eyes were bright. She said it the way she said things she had already decided firmly, clearly, like setting something down in the right place. "Yes," she said. "That's what I want." He took her hand again. She squeezed his fingers once hard, the way you held on to something you intended to keep. Ethan found them standing there a few minutes later, and looked at their joined hands with the focused, analytical expression he used on Chester and on hawk sightings, and on all other phenomena that merited serious attention. "Are you getting married?" he asked. Sarah looked at Jack. Jack looked at Ethan. "We're talking about it," Jack said. "Lily said you would," Ethan announced. "She said she could tell. She said she's been able to tell for a long time." He appeared to consider whether this information was useful. "I couldn't tell, but I was busy with Chester." "Of course," Jack said. Ethan looked at him for a moment longer. "You're good to her," he said, meaning his mother in the direct and unfiltered way of a child who had decided something and was reporting on it. "You're good to us." He appeared to find this conclusion satisfactory. "Okay," he said and walked away toward the stable as if he had completed a transaction. Sarah was laughing again. That same surprised, real, unguarded laugh. Her hand still in Jack's, her face turned toward the afternoon sun, and he stood there and listened to it, and thought about how long this ranch had been without that sound, and how little he had understood what he was missing until it arrived. 6 months after a woman with 2 hungry children had sat behind a diner in Harlan Creek with nothing left but her spine and her love for her kids. She stood on the porch of a working ranch in Montana and watched her son race across the field toward the stable, and her daughter sit on the fence with a book across her knees, and she breathed the air of a life she had not expected to have. Harold Pierce would file one more complaint in June. It would be dismissed in 3 days. He would not file again. Margaret Cole would become a regular presence at the Sunday table, which Agnes tolerated with a grace that Jack privately found impressive. Cal would be best man at the wedding in October, and he would cry during the ceremony and deny it afterward with complete conviction and zero credibility. Lily would read her essay at the reception, the one about watching her mother work, the one about love being the hard thing done when no one was watching. She would read it in a clear, steady voice without stopping, and half the room would be unable to speak by the time she finished, and Sarah would stand beside Jack with his hand in hers and let herself feel every word without bracing against it. And Ethan would fall asleep at the table before the dancing started with a piece of wedding cake half finished in front of him, and nobody would move him, because some things were perfect exactly as they were. A family is not always built by blood. Sometimes it is built by a woman who refused to break when every circumstance was designed to break her. By a man who looked at a plate of someone else's leftovers and understood exactly what was being asked of him. By 2 children who held each other's portions in the dark and learned eventually that they could put them down. Sometimes it begins with 5 words from a stranger whose voice cracked when he said them. Sometimes it begins with a woman who was brave enough to believe that those 5 words were true. And it lasts because both of them every single day choose to make it last. That is not a small thing. That is everything.